In 2015, a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology pressed a dental drill into a petrous bone recovered from a burial site near Volterra, in the heart of ancient Etruria. The petrous, a pyramid-shaped wedge of rock-dense tissue sitting directly behind the ear, is the hardest bone in the human body. It preserves DNA the way amber preserves insects. In conditions that would reduce every other biological trace to nothing, it holds the genome intact for thousands of years, sometimes longer. What came out of that particular drill hole was about to destabilize one of the most confidently held origin stories in Western civilization. Here is the thing. The identity of the Etruscans, the people who built the civilization that Rome absorbed and eventually obscured, had been debated for over 2,000 years. Herodotus said they came from Anatolia, from the coast of modern Turkey, carried by ships across the Aegean following a famine. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BC, insisted they were indigenous, evolved from the Italian peninsula itself. For centuries, the argument went nowhere because the evidence available could not resolve it. Then came ancient DNA, and the Etruscan question seemed briefly to be solved in 2007. A team using mitochondrial DNA, a narrow strip of genetic material passed only through the maternal line, published a study suggesting that modern Tuscans shared genetic affinities with Anatolian populations. The press coverage was immediate. Herodotus vindicated at last. Case closed. Except it was not closed. It had barely been opened. Mitochondrial DNA is one thread in a tapestry. It follows one line of inheritance, the mother's mother's mother's, back through time, and ignores everything else, using it to reconstruct a population. History of an entire civilization is a little like trying to understand the demographics of an entire city by interviewing one person per household and only asking about their mother's side. You will get data. You will get real data, but the picture it produces is partial in ways that can be systematically misleading, and in 2007 the technology to do better simply did not exist yet. Ancient nuclear DNA, the full diploid genome, capturing both maternal and paternal ancestry across billions of base pairs, required sequencing machinery and computational infrastructure that was still years away from being applied to archaeological bone. So the mitochondrial study stood. The Anatolian origin story, already ancient, got a modern imprimatur, and then the petrous bone changed everything. By 2021, the field had moved into a completely different methodological era. A team led by Cosimo Post at the University of Tübingen published the most comprehensive analysis of ancient Etruscan genomes ever assembled, full nuclear, sequencing from 27 individuals spanning roughly 900 years of Etruscan civilization. And the finding was not what anyone had predicted. The Etruscans were not primarily Anatolian. They were not genetic arrivals from the Eastern Mediterranean carrying a foreign culture into the Italian peninsula. They were genomically almost indistinguishable from their Latin-speaking neighbors. Two civilizations, one that would go on to build Rome, one that left behind an undeciphered language and a material culture so distinct it still resists full interpretation. And virtually identical DNA. Sit with that for a second. Because what it means is that the Etruscan language, the last survivor of a pre-Indo-European tradition that may have roots reaching back thousands of years into Italian prehistory, was not carried to the peninsula from somewhere else. It was already there. The genes changed, repeatedly as they always do. The language persisted, and every attempt to decode Etruscan identity through genetic origin had been, for decades, asking the wrong question entirely. But okay, the Etruscans are 6th century BC. That is ancient history by any reasonable measure. And the methodological lesson there, that cultural identity and genetic ancestry are not the same thing, is compelling, but it is also traceable, bounded. Something you can mentally file under the ancient world was complicated. What you cannot file away as easily is what happened during the empire itself. Because the imperial Rome numbers are not a nuance. They are a rupture, and they land hardest precisely because Rome is the civilization most people think they already understand. In 2019, a study led by Margaret Antonio and Jonathan Pritchard at Stanford, analyzing 127 ancient genomes from individuals buried across Rome and central Italy, published a finding that made researchers in the field check the methodology twice before accepting the numbers. During the imperial period, spanning roughly the 1st through 4th centuries AD, the genetic ancestry of people buried in and around Rome shifted by approximately 50% toward Eastern Mediterranean sources. Syria, Lebanon, Greece, Anatolia. Not a trickle. Not a marginal adjustment at the edges of the distribution. Half the genome of people buried in the capital of the ancient world was now pointing back toward the eastern provinces, rather than toward the Iron Age Italian populations that preceded them. And I cannot stress this enough. This was not one site. It was not a single anomalous burial assemblage that could be attributed to a merchant enclave or a diplomatic quarter. It replicated across independent sites using different extraction platforms, confirmed by different research teams. The shift was real, it was massive, and it was happening simultaneously across the city. 50% Eastern Mediterranean admixture, appearing within roughly 4 centuries of Roman imperial expansion. The mechanism is not mysterious once you understand the demographic weight of the empire. Rome at its peak had a population of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, in a world where most cities topped out well below 100,000. Maintaining that population, let alone growing it, required continuous net migration into the city from the broader imperial system. And the broader imperial system was overwhelmingly Eastern. The conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BC flooded Rome with Greek-speaking slaves, freed people, merchants, and intellectuals. The annexation of the Syrian and Levantine provinces brought the demographic weight of the Eastern Mediterranean directly into the Western capital's labor market. The Punic Wars alone, 3 conflicts spanning over a century, created massive displacement across the Mediterranean basin, and Rome absorbed much of that displaced population. The DNA was tracking Roman expansion more precisely than any surviving text. The genome was the actual census. Look, there is a version of the story that emphasizes cultural continuity, that Latin persisted, that Roman law persisted, that the institutional architecture of the empire persisted regardless of who was carrying those institutions in their bodies. And that version is not wrong exactly, but the word continuity is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting when half the genome has shifted in 4 centuries. And here is the thing, the Roman period was not even the first time this had happened. It was not even the second. If you want to understand why the Italian genome story is so disorienting, you need to go back further, way further, because before the Romans, before the Etruscans, before any of the Iron Age populations whose names appear in ancient texts, the Italian peninsula had already been demographically rewritten twice. Twice. Complete overwrites. Population replacement so thorough that the people who built the early Roman settlements shared only a fraction of their ancestry with the people who had stood on the same soil 3,000 years before them. The first rewrite happened around 9,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherers, the original Homo sapiens settlers of Europe, descended from people who had occupied the continent since the last ice age, were replaced across most of the Italian peninsula by Anatolian farmers moving westward through the Aegean and into the Mediterranean basin. These were not marginal movements or occasional intermarriages. Studies including the 2015 analysis by Wolfgang Hack and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute, which synthesized genomic data from 230 ancient Europeans, showed that in most of Central and Northern Europe, Anatolian farmer ancestry displaced hunter-gatherer ancestry at rates exceeding 70 to 80%. In Italy, the pattern was similar. The farmers brought agriculture, permanent settlements, pottery traditions, and their genome. The hunter-gatherers did not disappear entirely. Something between 15 and 25% of their ancestry survived in subsequent Italian populations, compressed into a minority signal beneath the Anatolian majority. But the population that built the Neolithic sites of the Italian peninsula was, in genetic terms, barely continuous with the population that had preceded it, and then, roughly 5,000 years ago, a second wave arrived from an entirely different direction. Steppe pastoralists, the Yamnaya-related cultures of the Pontic-Caspian grasslands, east of modern Ukraine, expanded westward with extraordinary speed, and their genetic signal is now detectable across the entire European genome, including Italy's. A 2017 study by David Reich's lab at Harvard, synthesizing data from hundreds of ancient individuals, confirmed that steppe ancestry reached central Italy by the Bronze Age, contributing approximately 30% of the ancestry present in Iron Age Italian populations. Which means, and here is where the compounding becomes almost difficult to track. By the time the traditional founding date of Rome arrives, 753 BC, the people standing on the Palatine Hill had already been genetically reconstituted twice. Whatever their immediate cultural inheritance, the Latin language, the Etruscan material influence, the early Roman ritual tradition, their genome was a layered composite of Anatolian farmers, steppe pastoralists, and a diminishing residue of the original European hunter-gatherers. The clean story was never clean. It was simply unexamined. If you are still here and your sense of history has not completely unraveled yet, hit subscribe. We go this deep into the actual data every single week, and I promise you the other data sets are just as disorienting. So 3 massive population movements before the Roman Empire even begins. Hunter-gatherers replaced by Anatolian farmers. Farmers partially overwritten by steppe pastoralists. The resulting Bronze Age and Iron Age Italians then transformed 50% Eastern Mediterranean admixture during the imperial period itself. Each rupture compounding the previous one, each one erasing a portion of what came before while preserving enough to maintain cultural thread. And then, after Rome, one more, the Lombards, a Germanic people from Scandinavia by origin, filtered through centuries of movement across Central Europe, entering northern Italy in 568 AD, in what every chronicle describes as a migration. And what the genomic data confirms was exactly that. A 2018 study led by Krishna Virama at Stony Brook University analyzed burials from Lombard cemeteries in Pannonia, modern Hungary, and Italy, and found that the Lombard migration was genuine in a biological sense. Not elite diffusion, where a small ruling group adopts a cultural label while the underlying population remains largely unchanged. Not simply the spread of a fashion. The individuals buried in early Lombard cemeteries in Italy showed strikingly northern and central European genetic profiles, high steppe ancestry, lower Eastern Mediterranean admixture than the Roman-era population, before gradually blending into the broader Italian genetic landscape over subsequent generations. The migration left a permanent signal in northern Italian populations, detectable today. Right? A 5th rupture? After everything else, a 5th rupture. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, geographically, temporally, genomically, sits Sardinia, an island that somehow held on. A 2019 study published in Nature Genetics confirmed what researchers had suspected for years. Modern Sardinians are, genetically, the closest living population to the Neolithic Anatolian farmers who entered Europe roughly 9,000 years ago. They missed most of the steppe ancestry wave. They absorbed relatively little Eastern Mediterranean admixture during the Roman period. They are, in genomic terms, a time capsule, a living reference population for what European farming communities looked like before the Bronze Age steppe expansion rewrote the mainland. In a dataset defined by replacement and compounding transformation, Sardinia is the control group. The one population that stayed close enough to the original signal to be readable. Before we get to what this means for every other national origin story, don't drop a comment and tell me which part of this rewrite hit hardest for you. The Etruscan finding tends to divide people. The Imperial Rome numbers tend to silence them. Here is what ties all of this together, because the individual ruptures, extraordinary as they are not the actual finding. The actual finding is what they collectively prove about the relationship between genetic identity and cultural identity. It is not just that these two things sometimes diverge. It is that the Italian genome is a continuous demonstration that they can diverge completely, repeatedly, across every scale of time, and the cultural narrative can persist anyway. The Latin language outlasted the population that originally spoke it. Roman law outlasted the genetic continuity of the population that wrote it. The Etruscan language persisted across what the genomic data suggests was already a deeply mixed, repeatedly transformed population. Culture, it turns out, is not stored in the genome. It is stored somewhere else entirely. In institutions, in texts, in transmitted practices, in the slow accumulation of shared assumption. And genes, for all their precision as historical evidence, cannot tell you which language the people they came from spoke, or what gods they honored, or which dead they mourned. Some researchers argue for more continuity than this framing implies. It is a defensible position in that it emphasizes the minority ancestry that did survive each transition. The 15 to 25% hunter-gatherer signal that persisted into the Bronze Age. The Iron Age Italian ancestry that was not entirely displaced by Eastern Mediterranean admixture during the imperial period. The argument has the appeal of restraint, but it becomes increasingly difficult to hold against the actual numbers. 50% Eastern Mediterranean admixture is not a continuity argument. It is a replacement argument with a remaining half. What makes the Italian dataset so important is not just its scale, though the dataset is now substantial, with hundreds of ancient genomes covering nearly 10,000 years of demographic history. It is its specificity. These are not anonymous ancient populations. They are populations attached to named civilizations, documented events, surviving texts, excavated cities. The genomic findings can be cross-referenced against things people already know. The Punic Wars, the Pax Romana, the Lombard invasion. And what the cross-referencing shows, consistently, is that the demographic events were real, they were massive, and the historical record almost never captured their true biological scale. There are still gaps. Southern Italian ancient DNA remains underrepresented in the dataset. And the full picture of how the Eastern Mediterranean admixture distributed across the peninsula, whether it concentrated in urban centers like Rome and remained thinner in rural hinterlands, or whether it penetrated the whole system equally, is still being worked out. The next petrous bone could shift those numbers. The next burial assemblage from Calabria or Sicily could complicate the southern picture in ways that are currently only partially visible. The dataset is growing, and growing datasets in ancient genomics tend to add complexity rather than simplify it. But the core finding is not going to be revised into comfortable territory. The people who call themselves Italian today are the genomic product of at least 5 major demographic transformations, layered across 9,000 years, each one partially overwriting the previous. None of them complete enough to erase the accumulated composite entirely. They are not descended in any simple linear sense from the builders of Rome. The builders of Rome were not descended in any simple linear sense from the people who laid the foundations of the earliest Latin settlements. And those early Latin settlers were not descended in any simple linear sense from the hunter-gatherers who first walked the peninsula after the Ice Age retreated. And yet, here is the thing that the genome cannot quite explain. And that makes it the most interesting scientific instrument in historical research, and also the most limited. Something called Italian has persisted. Through every rupture, every replacement, Every wave of migration that genomic data has now confirmed at the 50% and 60% and 70% level. A cultural continuity survived that the DNA alone would never predict. The language evolved but descended. The artistic tradition transformed but connected. The legal inheritance reached forward through population after population that had no biological claim to it and adopted it anyway. That is the actual paradox the Italian genome leaves you with. Not that the people were replaced, the data on that is now overwhelming, but that the culture survived the replacement. Every nation tells itself a story about biological origins. Italy's version of that story, like every other version, was not true in the ways it claimed to be true. The genome proved that. But the stranger finding, the one that takes longer to sit with, is that the story kept mattering to people who had no genetic reason to claim it. Which raises a question the Petrus bone cannot answer, and that the next 10,000 ancient genomes will not resolve. If cultural identity does not live in DNA, where does it live? And if the Italians were never who they thought they were, biologically, ancestrally, genomically, how did they remain, in every other sense, exactly themselves?